Welcome to History to Relax, the channel where you can slow down, take a breath, and drift into the past at your own pace. Tonight's story is quiet, but powerful. We'll take you through the final years before the Second World War, not from the view of the battlefield or the politics, but through the eyes of ordinary Jewish families living in Germany. As their rights were stripped away, their voices silenced, and their lives slowly erased. One law, one shop window, one school desk at a time. This story isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It's about the quiet moments, the slow unraveling, the daily fear, the small rituals kept alive behind closed curtains. A story that shows how the cruelty began long before the camps, and how people held on to dignity and faith even as the world around them collapsed. So kick back, dim the lights, and settle into a comfortable spot. This is a place to reflect, to remember, to listen. And before we begin, take a second to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this quiet corner of history can reach. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin the story. Part 1. A Normal Life Interrupted. In the quiet of a Berlin morning, the sound of boots hadn't yet echoed in the alleyways. Curtains still fluttered with the promise of a spring breeze. People rose from sleep with familiar routines, the kind passed down through generations. Stretch, wash, coffee on the stove. It was 1933, and for many German Jews, the world had not yet turned its full weight against them. Not outwardly, not officially. There was still the echo of old friendships, the daily rhythm of streetcars, the smell of bread from corner bakeries. But underneath that normalcy, something was beginning to shift, subtle at first, then deliberate. Erich Rosenfeld ran a small shoe repair shop 2 blocks off Alexanderplatz. He had taken over from his father, who had served in the trenches during the Great War and returned with a limp and a quiet pride in being both Jewish and German. The walls of the shop were lined with worn boots and faded photographs. A wedding, a harvest festival, his father in a Prussian uniform. Each morning, Erich would sweep the pavement, unlock the front door, and greet the day with practiced calm. He had a wife, Miriam, and 2 children, both in school. Their world, while modest, felt safe enough, until the wrong posters started appearing on the walls nearby. They showed exaggerated faces, bent noses, wild caricatures with slogans in block letters. The Jew is our misfortune. Don't buy from Jewish merchants. At first, Erich tore them down in quiet anger. Then he realized they would be replaced the next morning. The man who once bought his shoes polished every month stopped coming. The delivery boy made a snide comment one day, eyes gleaming with something Erich didn't recognize, or didn't want to. It was as if the air itself had shifted, carrying with it something sour, something heavy. In the schoolyard, children noticed it too. Lee Rosenfeld, just 10, came home one afternoon with her books pressed tight against her chest. Her voice trembled as she told her parents that the headmaster had asked all non-Aryan children to stay seated during a patriotic anthem. She was one of only 2 left sitting. The other was a boy named Jacob, whose family lived above a tailor's shop. That night, Erich sat at the dinner table in silence while Miriam stirred soup no one really touched. The radio buzzed faintly in the corner, some speech about national renewal, about purifying the soul of Germany. The rhetoric grew sharper as winter melted into spring. The new chancellor, Adolf Hitler, was being taken seriously now. His voice was everywhere, on radios, in newspaper columns, at town meetings. There had been riots. There had been book burnings. There had been fire. Erich remembered standing behind the counter as 2 men in brown shirts stepped inside. They looked around, said nothing at first. One picked up a boot, inspected it, then placed it down without a word. The other leaned close and said quietly, "Shouldn't you consider selling? Might not be safe here much longer." And then they left. Miriam began storing documents in a locked drawer. birth certificates, her mother's marriage papers, a family tree dating back generations to prove German ancestry. But it didn't matter. Being Jewish was no longer just a religion or a community. It had become a stain in the eyes of the law. New edicts were coming down weekly. Jews could no longer hold positions in public service. Teachers were dismissed. Judges stripped of their roles. One neighbor, a physician, had his medical license revoked overnight and was forced to close his clinic with no explanation except a sealed envelope delivered by hand. There were whispers about lists, about quotas, about censuses that asked new kinds of questions. In cafes, where once debate had been lively and open, people now looked over their shoulders before speaking. Some friends avoided eye contact altogether. Others turned away entirely, crossing the street as if they hadn't seen Eric or Miriam or any of the other familiar faces they had once known well. It wasn't just fear. It was convenience. It was survival. By mid-year, Jewish businesses were being marked. Sometimes with paint. Sometimes with bricks. The Rosenfeld shop had its front window shattered one night. No one saw who did it, and no one offered to help clean it up. Eric swept the glass into a bucket alone, the morning sun glinting off every shard like a warning. Miriam suggested they close the shop for a few days, but he shook his head. If we hide, they win, he said, though even he could hear the doubt in his voice. At synagogue, attendance dwindled. Not because faith had faltered, but because people were being watched. Uniformed men stood outside sometimes, writing names. Others came inside and sat in the back rows, silent, their eyes scanning every prayer. There were arrests now, usually in the dark, always without warning. A cousin disappeared. A school teacher vanished. The papers said nothing. The radios stayed silent. But everyone knew. One Friday afternoon, Lee came home with a red smear on her cheek. Another student had thrown ink at her during a reading of a patriotic poem. The teacher had said nothing. When Miriam went to the school to speak with the principal, he apologized politely but said his hands were tied. The political climate, he said softly, is very sensitive now. Miriam walked home with her daughter without saying a word. That summer, many Jewish families stopped vacationing. Parks had new signs posted, Jews not allowed. Hotels refused bookings with certain names. Train stations became places of quiet humiliation. Eric remembered standing in line for tickets, only to be pulled aside and asked where he was going, why, and for how long. The man behind the counter took one look at his surname and tore the form in half. "Try the next town," he muttered. The irony was bitter. His father had fought for the fatherland in 1916, had bled into its soil. And now his family was being treated as outsiders, as enemies. The medals still hung in their hallway, but they meant nothing now. Legacy had no shield. Citizenship had no teeth. The WWII was no longer a home. It was becoming a trap. Newspapers began printing lists of approved businesses. Jewish-owned shops were omitted. Leaflets urged citizens to buy only from real Germans. SA men stood outside stores with placards. They didn't touch anyone, not yet, but their presence was enough. Customers turned away before even glancing at the window. Eric cut his prices in half. It didn't help. In August, the Rosenfelds received a letter from the city office. It informed them that their youngest, David, would not be eligible to attend secondary school the following year due to changes in admission policy. The letter did not mention the word Jew. It didn't have to. The family began talking about emigration, quietly, after dark, with the windows shut. Switzerland, Palestine, England, they had no connections. No foreign bank account. The paperwork was overwhelming. Visas required guarantees. Embassies were full. Letters went unanswered. Every week brought new stories of families being denied passage. And still, the rhetoric on the radio grew more fevered. One evening in October, Eric stood by the window as a group of boys marched past the building, singing nationalist songs. They wore crisp uniforms, armbands flashing in the fading light. One of them paused and stared directly up at the window. He raised his hand in salute. Eric let the curtain fall. That night, he could not sleep. He thought about the old man who once came to his shop every month without fail to have his shoes polished, and who now crossed the street when they passed. He thought about his daughter, trying to pretend she wasn't afraid at school. He thought about the cracks in their wall, literal and otherwise. And he thought about the silence, the deafening silence of a city watching its neighbors disappear. By year's end, Jewish newspapers had been shut down. Public transport no longer allowed Jewish passengers during rush hours. Curfews were rumored but not yet enforced. Every day brought new rumors, and worse, every rumor eventually became law. One morning, Eric walked into his shop and found a painted word across the door: Jude. Red, large, and dripping. It had been written in the night, and the paint had run down the wood like blood. He stood in front of it for a long time before reaching for a rag. The rag didn't work. Part 2. Marked by Faith. The first time Miriam Rosenfeld noticed the sign, she was walking home from the market with a cloth bag full of onions, soap, and a loaf of rye bread. It had been nailed to a wooden post outside a small government office. Plain, official-looking, and stamped with a black eagle. At first glance, it didn't seem unusual. Then her eyes settled on a single word printed in thick, bold letters: Nictarir. Non-Aryan. She stood there for a moment, reading the list below. It wasn't about arrests or violence. Not yet. It was a list of new rules. Jews, it said, could no longer work as civil servants, lawyers, or teachers in public schools. No Jews could hold government jobs or work in state-run hospitals. Names would be removed from payrolls. Contracts would be cancelled. No reason given, only the fact of being born Jewish. The bag in her hand felt heavier with every step home. She had known something like this was coming. Everyone had. But seeing it printed and nailed up in the open brought a new feeling. Not just fear, something colder, something deeper. She tried to remember the last time someone in their neighborhood had spoken to her without lowering their voice or glancing around first. That evening, as Eric wiped down the shoe counter with a tired hand, she told him what she saw. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he opened the drawer beside the register and took out the family's documents again. Birth certificates, marriage papers, records from the synagogue and the city office, proof of their German ancestry, or as much of it as could be shown on paper. "We've done everything right," he finally said. "We've worked, we've paid taxes, we've kept our heads down." Miriam nodded but didn't answer. They both knew it didn't matter anymore. The laws kept coming. One by one, new restrictions appeared like rain clouds that wouldn't lift. Jewish doctors were banned from treating Aryan patients. Jewish professors were dismissed from universities. Jewish children, even the youngest, were made to sit apart in classrooms or were no longer welcomed at all. Every rule came with a calm official voice, as if it were routine. Just another adjustment, nothing personal. Their friend Isaac, a well-known dentist in the city, had run his clinic for nearly 20 years. His waiting room had once been filled every morning with patients from all backgrounds. Then the new decree came: Jews could only treat Jews. Within a month, his practice had no patients at all. Not because people stopped trusting him, but because they were afraid to be seen walking through his door. Some still visited him at night, slipping into his home for care after sundown. They brought their children with sore teeth or came for advice on how to afford medicine. Isaac always helped, though each visit left him more nervous. Eventually, even the nighttime visits stopped. People were scared, and fear made them disappear. Eric tried to keep the shop running, but the brown shirts came more often now. Sometimes they only walked past, watching. Other times, they stepped inside, pretended to browse, and made quiet remarks. Once, they asked him to write Jewish-owned in large letters on the shop window. He refused. The next morning, someone else had done it for him, the words painted in thick black strokes across the glass. David, their youngest, began asking why people stared at him on the street. He had always been a cheerful boy, full of energy and endless questions. Now he walked more quietly, holding his mother's hand longer than before. When a group of boys from another school pushed him into a puddle and called him names, Miriam had to hold him tightly just to keep him from running back. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said again and again, tears in his eyes. She held him close and whispered, "I know. You didn't." In synagogue, the atmosphere had changed. Prayers still filled the air, but voices trembled more often now. There were fewer greetings, fewer embraces. People spoke in hushed tones. Some no longer came at all. It wasn't because they had lost faith, but because even sacred places had become dangerous. Uniformed men sometimes waited outside, not to listen, just to be seen. Their presence made every entrance feel like a risk. The rabbi still gave his sermons, but even his words had grown more careful. He talked about endurance. He talked about holding fast. He reminded everyone that the past had held darker times and that their people had survived worse. But in the silence between his words, the truth hung heavy. This was something new. Miriam noticed changes in the stores she used to visit. The grocer who once saved her favorite apples no longer spoke to her directly. A seamstress she had known since before marriage pretended not to recognize her at all. People were pulling away, not with anger, but with silence. It was a quiet retreat, as if kindness itself had become dangerous. Then came the letters. One after another, notices arrived in the mail. They were written in plain language but carried sharp meaning. One informed them that their ration card would no longer be renewed. Another explained that David's enrollment at school was under review. Still another required them to register with the local office as persons of Jewish descent, listing full names, family connections, and proof of residence. No one came to their door. No one shouted. But the paper trail was clear. They were being marked, not with fire, not with chains, but with forms, files, and ink. A neighbor, Frau Lieberman, came to visit one afternoon with trembling hands. Her brother, a World War I veteran, had been dismissed from his factory job without notice. He had been told that his Jewish background now disqualified him. The company said it regretted the decision but had no choice under the new laws. "He served in the trenches," she said, her voice cracking. "He was wounded. He nearly lost a leg." Miriam offered tea, but neither of them touched it. What comfort could be given when honor no longer counted? Even the cemetery changed. One day, the family visited Eric's father's grave, as they always did on his birthday. They found a sign posted by the gate, "Jewish section under review, entry restricted." A guard stood nearby, arms crossed, watching every step. Eric asked him what it meant, but the man only shrugged and said the city was making changes. That night, Miriam sat at the kitchen table with a piece of cloth in her lap. She had begun sewing again, not for income, but to keep her hands busy. She stitched quiet shapes, small repairs, anything to distract herself. The radio in the corner played soft music, then switched to another speech. They had stopped listening closely. The words were always the same: purity, loyalty, tradition, strength. Faith, in that time, became quieter. Miriam no longer lit candles at the window, but only deep in the room. She wrapped them in cloth when not in use, so no one passing by could see. Their family prayers grew softer, spoken almost like secrets. They didn't stop observing their holidays, but the joy in those moments had dimmed. It wasn't shame that quieted them. It was fear of being seen. In late autumn, Eric received a visit from an old friend named Martin, who had once been a frequent customer. He was not Jewish, but had always been kind. They sat in the back room, sipping tea that had grown bitter from sitting too long. "I came to tell you something," Martin said, looking at the floor. "There's a list being prepared at City Hall. A registry." Eric nodded. "We already registered," he said. Martin shook his head. "Not just names. Addresses. Professions. Family connections. They're separating everything. I don't know what it means yet, but," his voice trailed off. They sat in silence, the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. It was the first kindness Eric had felt in weeks, and even that kindness came with warning. Soon after, the city issued new identification papers. Jews had to carry them at all times. A red J had been stamped beside the name. Clerks no longer pretended it was routine. They handed the papers across the desk without meeting anyone's eyes. Lee cried when she saw hers. "Why do I need a different paper?" she asked. Miriam held her, smoothing her hair. "Because they want to make sure we're easier to find." That answer was the truth, and saying it out loud made her stomach twist. As winter approached, new restrictions fell like frost. Jews were banned from using public libraries. They could no longer own radios. Travel between cities required written approval. Curfews were discussed, then slowly introduced. In some areas, Jews were told to vacate certain neighborhoods. The word relocation began to appear in letters, always vague, never explained. Miriam noticed that their mail sometimes arrived already opened. Once, she found a letter with its seal broken and a page missing. When she asked the postman, he only shrugged. Mistakes happen. They had learned not to argue, not to raise voices, not to ask questions. In the weeks leading up to Hanukkah, Eric debated whether they should celebrate at all. The menorah sat in its usual box, wrapped in cloth, waiting. On the first night, they lit one candle, far from the window, deep in the kitchen, shielded from view. They said their blessings in low voices, afraid of being heard. That night, they sat at the table for a long time after the flame went out. They didn't speak much. There was nothing new to say. Outside, the wind moved through empty streets. They hadn't broken any laws. They hadn't caused trouble. They hadn't spoken out. And still, every piece of their life was being taken, slowly and deliberately, until all that remained was the label they'd been born with. They were not citizens anymore. They were not neighbors. They were not professionals or veterans or parents in the eyes of the WWII. They were Jews. And that was all the state chose to see. Part 3. Shut out. The change didn't happen overnight, but it didn't take long either. One by one, the doors began to close. Some shut with words, others with silence, and many were locked without a sound. In early 1935, the Rosenfeld family found themselves standing in front of the public library, their coats pulled tight against the cold, a notice taped to the heavy wooden doors. Miriam read it aloud under her breath, admission restricted to Aryan citizens. It didn't say Jews directly, but everyone understood what it meant. The words were chosen carefully, not to explain, only to exclude. Lee had come hoping to borrow a new book about animals. She had been reading more lately, trying to escape in stories. When she heard her mother's voice trail off, she looked up and asked, "Does that mean us?" Miriam nodded slowly and placed her hand on her daughter's back. "Yes, sweetheart. It means us." That was how it began. One piece at a time. Jews could no longer enter libraries. Then came museums, swimming pools, city gardens. Public spaces that once belonged to everyone were no longer open. There were no guards posted. No bars on the gates. Just small printed signs, nailed up or hung on windows, telling them they weren't welcome anymore. For Eric, the most painful change came from the guild. He had been a shoemaker his entire life, not a rich man, but proud of his work. When he went to renew his license that spring, he was told by a pale-faced clerk that Jewish tradesmen were being removed from official roles. The clerk kept his eyes down the whole time and slid a rejection letter across the counter like he was handing over a receipt. "This is final?" Eric asked, though he already knew. The clerk gave a short nod. "You're no longer permitted to run a business." He walked home slowly that day, the letter folded in his coat pocket. His fingers, still rough from years of leather and nails, gripped the edge of the paper tightly. When he reached the shop, he didn't unlock the door. He just stood there, staring at the window where the words Jewish owned had once been painted and then scraped away, only to leave a shadow behind. His reflection looked older than he remembered. When Miriam saw him, she knew without asking. She sat beside him at the kitchen table as he unfolded the letter. They didn't speak for a long time. The kettle boiled and clicked off by itself. That same week, the bakery 2 streets over refused to serve them. They had gone there every Saturday for years. The baker, Herr Meissner, had once slipped an extra roll into Lee's paper bag just because he liked her smile. Now he stood stiffly behind the counter and said, "We no longer serve your kind." His voice didn't shake. He didn't look angry. Just cold. Like he had already practiced the words in his head. David tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why is he mad?" "He's not mad," Miriam said, keeping her eyes forward. "He's afraid." The butcher, the tailor, even the greengrocer, one by one, they followed. Not all at once, and not always with cruelty. Some just posted signs. Others said nothing and looked away. The world around them kept turning, but fewer places let them join in. At school, things had worsened for the children. David's teacher no longer called on him during lessons. His seat was moved to the very back of the room. Once, when he tried to ask a question, the teacher said, "This material is not meant for you." He came home confused and quiet, clutching his satchel like it held the answer. Lee was told not to participate in a class project on German history. When she asked why, the teacher smiled tightly and said, "Because you don't belong to that history." She cried for the first time in weeks that night. Miriam sat on the floor beside her bed, holding her hand through the covers. Eric sat nearby, staring out the dark window. No one knew what to say anymore. Their synagogue remained open, but attendance continued to shrink. Some families had already left the country. Others were preparing to go. Many stayed because they had nowhere else to run. Their names were being removed from travel lists. Their passports were questioned. The world beyond Germany was beginning to turn away too. One of Eric's cousins had sent a letter from Amsterdam. He wrote about safety, about open streets and kind neighbors. But even in his handwriting, there was tension. "Come if you can," he wrote. "But hurry. Things are changing everywhere." Back in Berlin, the Rosenfelds tried to keep their routines. Miriam still cleaned the house. Eric still mended old shoes at the kitchen table, not for money, just to feel useful. The children still studied. But each routine felt smaller than before, as if their world was shrinking around them, folding in with every new law. One afternoon, a neighbor knocked on their door, a young man named Emil who had once shared coffee with Eric on quiet Sundays. He stood on the front step holding a folded newspaper. "I thought you should see this," he said. It was a new decree. Jews were now banned from using public benches, restricted from certain shopping hours, and forbidden to own pets. Eric scanned the page, his eyes stopping at the smallest line at the bottom. Violators will be punished. Emil apologized before leaving. "I don't know what to say anymore," he murmured. "Neither do we," Eric replied. They heard stories from other families. A cousin had been spit on while waiting for a tram. A friend's shop was looted, and the police never came. A teacher had been forced to give up her apartment and move into a cramped room on the city's edge. When they visited relatives across town, Miriam noticed something new. The way people walked faster, spoke less, looked over their shoulders before mentioning anything about the government. Even children had begun to copy the caution. They whispered at home, then returned to school and pretended nothing was wrong. One evening, Miriam's brother Jacob stopped by. He was thin, his jacket loose, his face lined. He had been let go from his job at the post office months ago and had been surviving on odd jobs and favors. Now, even those were drying up. "I heard from someone," he said quietly. "They're planning more removals. Not arrests. Just relocations." Eric frowned. "Where to?" Jacob shook his head. "They don't say. But it's happening in other towns. Families are being moved without notice. No one knows where." They sat together in silence. The children had already gone to bed. Outside, the streetlights flickered. That winter was bitter. Snow fell early and stayed long. The Rosenfelds kept their curtains drawn at night. Fires burned low to save wood. They stopped attending public events. There were fewer letters from friends. Less laughter from the neighbors. The city seemed quieter, but not peaceful, only withdrawn. A new law required all Jewish homes to display a notice outside, "This household is of Jewish descent." Eric nailed the paper to the door himself. He didn't want someone else doing it. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at the house where he had raised his children, where his father had once lived. It didn't feel like theirs anymore. Even the simplest pleasures were stripped away. They were banned from owning bicycles, then typewriters, then radios. Each item taken meant another way of being cut off from the rest of the world. David once asked, "Why can't we ride bikes?" Eric tried to explain. "Because they want us to stop moving." They no longer sat by the window. They no longer sang during dinner. They whispered in the hallway. And still, the world outside grew colder. One day, the family received a letter from the city office. It ordered them to leave their home within 30 days. No reason was given. No apology offered. The space was being reallocated. They would be moved to a building with other Jewish families on the far side of the city. Their apartment was small, but it had been theirs. The wallpaper in David's room still bore the drawings he had made as a child. The kitchen window looked out onto a courtyard where Lee had once played with chalk. Miriam had planted tulips by the stairs. Now, they had to leave. They packed slowly. Each item brought memories. Each drawer held something they didn't want to let go. But they had no choice. The building they were moved into was cramped and grey, with peeling paint and no heat. They shared a floor with 3 other families. The hallway smelled of coal dust and damp shoes. Still, they tried to make a home again. Miriam hung a photo of her parents above the kitchen sink. Eric carved a wooden stool for David. Lee arranged her books on a makeshift shelf. Life went on, even as the walls pressed closer. In that final month before spring, a notice arrived requiring Jews to surrender all valuables: jewelry, gold, savings over a certain amount. They brought what they had to the collection office. A man in uniform stood behind the counter and took Miriam's wedding ring without a word. Her hand felt bare afterward. When they walked home that evening, They passed a park where children played in the snow. None of them were Jewish. Signs at the entrance made that clear. David stopped and stared through the gate. "Do you think we'll ever go back there?" he asked. Miriam looked at her son. His face was older now, thinner, his eyes quiet. She crouched beside him and answered with care. "I don't know. But we'll keep walking forward. One day at a time." And so they did. Part 4. The Boycotts. April 1st, 1933, was a Saturday. The sun had just begun to warm the cobblestone streets of Berlin. Markets opened like they always had. Shops raised their shutters. Delivery carts clattered by on narrow alleys. But something in the air felt wrong. Not loud. Not violent. Just off, like a room where someone had whispered a secret before you walked in. At first, Eric Rosenfeld thought it was a normal weekend. He woke early, put on his coat, and prepared to open his shoe shop. The streets seemed quiet, though. Too quiet for a Saturday morning. The usual sounds were missing. No footsteps of regular customers. No greetings from shopkeepers setting out baskets of goods. Just a strange hush. When he reached the corner, he saw them. Brown uniformed men standing shoulder to shoulder outside a Jewish-owned pharmacy. One of them held a sign, "Don't buy from Jews." Another pointed to the window with a stern expression. The owner, an older man named Herr Lowenstein, stood frozen behind the glass. He didn't open the door. He didn't need to. No one would come in. Eric kept walking, faster now. As he neared his shop, his stomach sank. Two more brown shirts stood in front of it, arms folded, signs leaning against the door. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their message was written in black paint across a whiteboard. Germans. Defend yourselves. Don't buy from Jews. He froze. For a moment, he stood across the street, unsure whether to cross. The streets were still empty, but eyes watched from behind curtains and half-open windows. He could feel them. Not angry. Not supportive. Just curious, as if waiting to see what he would do. Miriam had told him not to go in that morning. She had heard rumors all week, whispers from neighbors, quiet warnings at the synagogue. Some said the SA were planning something. Others said it would be nothing. Just noise. Just for show. A single day, then it would pass. But now he was standing in front of his shop, and it was clear this wasn't just noise. He walked forward anyway. One of the men stepped slightly in his path. Not blocking him outright, just enough to make his presence known. Eric nodded and reached into his coat pocket for the key. His hand trembled slightly, but he managed to unlock the door. The man didn't move. He simply said, flatly, "You'd be wise to close for the day." Eric didn't reply. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and let out a slow breath. The shop was just as he had left it the night before. Clean counter. Polished tools. A row of freshly repaired boots lined along the wall. But the silence pressed against the windows like a heavy cloth. He didn't open the shutters that day. The boycott had begun. Across the city, across the country, men in brown uniforms had positioned themselves outside Jewish shops, clinics, law offices, and workshops. They carried signs, handed out leaflets, and shouted at anyone who dared to approach. They didn't use force, not openly, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Some people turned away in discomfort. Others nodded at the men and crossed the street proudly. It was a test. And the message was clear. Jews were no longer part of the national community. That evening, Eric walked home in silence. When he arrived, Miriam met him at the door, her face pale. "They came to the building," she whispered. "They asked which apartments were Jewish. The superintendent told them." He pointed. David and Lee sat quietly at the table, their dinner untouched. They were here. Eric asked. Miriam nodded. They didn't come in, but they wanted to be seen. He sat down slowly, resting his hands on the table. They want us afraid. We already are, she answered. The next morning, the boycott was still in place. More signs had gone up. Leaflets were being stuffed into mailboxes, lists of Jewish-owned businesses, addresses, instructions to protect German values by shopping elsewhere. Some were written with official stamps. Others looked handmade, angry scrawls on paper scraps. But they all shared the same message. Many neighbors stopped speaking to the Rosenfelds altogether. Some crossed the street when they saw them coming. Others gave quick nods and walked faster. It was as if fear had passed from person to person, like a quiet infection, not always seen, but always felt. A few tried to help in small ways. A young delivery boy, no older than 15, brought a sack of potatoes to their door without charge. He said his mother had sent them. Miriam thanked him gently. They never saw him again. His route changed the following week. By Monday, the newspapers were full of headlines. The German people stand up. National boycott a success. Pictures showed empty Jewish shops, silent streets, smiling SA men. There were no reports of violence, only civil defense. No mention of fear, only patriotism. Lee saw one of the papers lying on a bench and asked why their shop was called a threat. Eric didn't know how to answer her. It's not about what we've done, he finally said. It's about what we are. The boycott officially ended after 1 week, but the damage had already been done. Many customers never came back. Fear had done its work. Even without brown shirts on the corners, the silence remained. Some Jewish businesses tried to reopen. Others closed for good. Signs stayed up. Windows stayed dark. And slowly, quietly, the economy of Jewish families began to crumble. Eric tried to keep the shop running, but money was short. Supplies were harder to find. Leather dealers no longer returned his letters. Bank accounts had been frozen without notice. Every coin became more precious. He sold tools, then furniture. Miriam took in laundry, then sewing. They stretched every meal. They shared everything. The children noticed, even though their parents tried to shield them. David asked why dinner was smaller now. Lee offered to go without books so they could buy more coal. No one complained. But every act of sacrifice left a mark. In the synagogue, the rabbi spoke softly now. His sermons were not about hope, but about patience. We are strong, he said. Not because we fight, but because we endure. People nodded, but their eyes were heavy. Their patience was not endless. Rumors spread through the community. Stories of firings, evictions, and beatings. No names, just whispers. A shopkeeper in Leipzig had been arrested for suspicious activity. A teacher in Frankfurt had vanished. A lawyer in Munich was found in a park, his face bruised and his license revoked. No one said it directly, but everyone knew. Then came a new law. The Reich passed a decree stripping Jewish public servants of their pensions. Even those who had already retired, teachers, nurses, postal workers, lost everything. Jacob, Miriam's brother, had been depending on that pension. Now he had nothing. They invited him to stay with them, even though there was barely space. He brought with him a single suitcase and a notebook filled with names, friends, clients, distant relatives. All gone. He didn't talk much. He spent his days writing letters, all unanswered. In the middle of June, the city placed new signs on city benches, for Aryans only. Children saw them first. David asked if he could still sit on the grass. No one had written rules for that yet, but they all knew the answer was no. Later that week, the zoo posted signs at its gates, "Jews forbidden." It had been one of David's favorite places. He stood at the fence and stared at the giraffes through the bars. "I don't understand," he said. "Animals don't care who you are." Eric looked down at his son and gave a small, tired smile. "No, they don't." By autumn, the Rosenfelds were nearly invisible in their own city. They walked streets they no longer belonged to. They passed shops they could not enter. They read newspapers that never spoke their names. And yet, life continued. Slowly, carefully, with less and less light. They celebrated Rosh Hashanah in whispers, the windows shut tight. Miriam baked what she could. They said prayers by candlelight. It felt like a memory more than a holiday. On Yom Kippur, they fasted in silence. Eric had stopped shaving. His hands ached from cold and work. But he never stopped cleaning his shoes. Every night, he polished them before bed. Not for pride. Not for vanity. Just to remember who he was. The city had made them strangers. But they still belonged to one another. They were still a family. Still people. Still here. Even as the world around them pretended not to see. Part 5. The Yellow Letters. The letters began arriving in the spring. Yellow envelopes, thin and official-looking, stamped with the black eagle of the WWII. They didn't come all at once. Just one or two at first, slipped into mailboxes among bills and notices. But the color made them stand out, even before anyone opened them. The shade of yellow was deliberate, not cheerful, not soft. It was dull, mustard-like, the color of warning. The Rosenfelds received their first on a rainy Thursday. Eric picked it up from the postbox and studied it in silence. His name was printed in block letters, sharp and clean. The return address was from the local registration office. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he walked up the stairs slowly and placed it on the kitchen table. Miriam turned from the stove, her face stiff. "Is that?" He nodded. She didn't finish the question. They waited until after the children had gone to bed. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of dripping rain outside the window. When Eric finally opened the envelope, the paper inside was plain but cold. It was not a summons. Not yet. It was a directive. The letter informed them that, as Jews, they were now required to register every piece of personal property over a certain value. Jewelry, art, furniture, typewriters, radios, clocks, even rugs. The document asked for exact quantities, descriptions, and estimated worth. They were given 10 days to comply. There was no mention of what would be done with the information. No promise. No threat. Just the command to list and return. Miriam sat down beside him. "Do we list everything?" "I think we have to," Eric said quietly. "If we don't, they'll say we're hiding something." They spent that weekend going through their small apartment. Miriam took out her mother's silver candlesticks from the cupboard, wrapped in old fabric. They had been a wedding gift. Eric added his father's pocket watch, the one carried through the trenches in the Great War. Lee's small music box was set aside too, not valuable to anyone else, but still listed. They even wrote down a hand-painted bowl David had made in school. By the time the list was finished, it filled 4 pages. Eric walked it to the city office himself and handed it in at the front desk. The clerk barely looked up. He simply stamped it and placed it in a stack beside dozens of others. That was the beginning. The yellow letters kept coming. Each one carried a new instruction. Jews must declare foreign currency. Jews must report savings accounts. Jews must present family trees for review. Some letters requested photos. Others demanded certificates. Every envelope arrived with that same thick silence. No explanation, no questions allowed. Jacob, Miriam's brother, received a notice stating he was no longer considered a German citizen under the law. He brought the letter to their apartment, unfolded it on the table, and sat down with a blank stare. "I was born here," he said quietly. "I've never left the country. Never even been to another city without work papers." Eric read the document twice. It didn't accuse Jacob of anything. It simply stated that Jews were no longer eligible for citizenship under the WWII. Miriam folded the letter gently and slid it back into the envelope. "We're ghosts now," she said. Soon after, Jacob was told he had to wear a badge when leaving the house, a small symbol pinned to his coat that identified him as Jewish. At first, the rule applied only in certain areas, during certain hours. Then the regulations spread. More letters came. More rules. More forms. The children started noticing too. David asked why his name had been removed from the school list posted near the front gate. Lee's teacher no longer handed her graded papers. She was told to wait at the back of the room while the others participated in group exercises. Miriam tried to keep their routine steady. She made porridge each morning, swept the floor, kept the wash basin clean. But even the small chores felt heavier now, as if each one existed only to hold off what was coming next. Then came the order for identity cards. Another letter. This one required Jews to present themselves at the local police station for updated identification. The new cards had large red J stamps across the corner, burned into the paper. They also listed the person's religion in bold, unlike previous documents. No one explained why. When Eric and Miriam arrived at the station, they found a line already forming outside, men and women standing with envelopes clutched tightly in their hands. No one spoke. The air was heavy. A police officer opened the doors every few minutes, letting in only a few at a time. Inside, the process was quick and mechanical. A clerk asked for documents. Another snapped photographs without warning. A third handed over the new card. When Miriam received hers, she turned it over in her hands. It was strange to see herself reduced to ink and initials. Her name, her date of birth, her faith, and that red letter, simple and final. When she stepped outside, she realized she had begun holding her breath. She exhaled slowly. Lee asked later that night why they needed new cards. "Because the rules keep changing," Miriam answered. The next letter came a week later. This time, it told them they must surrender their radios. All Jews. No exceptions. Radios were to be handed over to the police or a designated collection center. The letter said this was to prevent unauthorized listening to foreign broadcasts. Eric stared at the small radio on their shelf. It had been in their family for years. They used to gather around it on Sunday evenings, listening to music or the occasional news. Now it sat quiet. David cried when they took it away. "We didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I know," Eric answered, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But they want us to forget what the world sounds like." Other families received worse letters. Some were told to vacate their homes with little notice. Others were instructed to report to work camps for labor service. One elderly couple they knew was fined for failing to report assets. No one had told them they needed to. The yellow letters came almost weekly now, sometimes more than one at a time. Miriam began storing them in a showbox beneath their bed. She called it her box of questions. None of them had answers. One afternoon, she noticed that Jacob hadn't returned from the market. Hours passed. The soup on the stove grew cold. Just as she was preparing to go look for him, a boy arrived at their door. He held out a folded slip of paper, unsigned, handwritten, brief. Jacob taken. Corner of Cottbusser. No struggle. That was all it said. Eric rushed out to ask questions. He walked for hours. He spoke to people who turned their heads, others who whispered, "Don't get involved." When he came home that night, his clothes were soaked from rain. He didn't speak. Miriam didn't ask. Jacob never returned. Weeks later, they received a yellow letter in Jacob's name. It ordered him to report for questioning at the city office, dated 10 days after his disappearance. There was nothing they could do. The yellow letters became heavier than their weight. Every time one arrived, it filled the house with tension. David once said, "I hate the mail now." Lee had begun checking the box nervously, holding her breath before opening it. Then came the census letter. It required all Jews to fill out a detailed record of their family history, listing relatives, places of birth, occupations, and religious status. It asked about marriage, travel, even names of old school teachers. The form was several pages long, printed in tight script. They were given 5 days to complete it. Miriam sat at the kitchen table with a pen, her handwriting trembling. "Why do they want all this?" she asked quietly. "To know everything," Eric answered. "So we can't disappear." The final page required signatures. A declaration of truth, beneath a warning that false information would result in arrest. They signed. There was nothing left to hide. In the weeks that followed, their movements became more limited. The tram no longer allowed Jewish passengers, except during off hours. The corner grocer, once kind, refused to sell them anything without a permit. The permit system was confusing and changed every few days. Sometimes they waited in lines only to be turned away. Even silence felt dangerous. One morning, they received another letter. This one told them that all Jewish households were now under supervised residency. They were not to leave the city without approval. Any changes in household members, guests, or travel plans must be reported. Eric folded the letter slowly. "We're prisoners now." Miriam nodded. Without walls. Their life had shrunk to 4 rooms and a street with no welcome. The children no longer asked when things would get better. They simply learned how to live smaller. David played quietly with stones. Lee wrote stories she never read aloud. And still, the letters came. Each one with new rules, new limits, new lines they could not cross. And still, the family stayed together. Because that was all they had left. Part 6. A Life Under Watch. The feeling of being watched crept in slowly at first. It didn't come with footsteps or knocks at the door. It came in glances. In pauses. In the sudden quiet that followed when someone walked into a room. It came in the way neighbors no longer asked questions, and no longer answered them, either. For the Rosenfeld family, life had become a careful performance. Every word, every movement, every choice had to be measured. Eric no longer read the newspaper out loud. Miriam folded the curtains twice to make sure the seams covered every inch of glass. The children were taught not to speak about anything they saw or heard, not to anyone, not even friends. The apartment, once filled with warm smells and quiet music, now felt more like a shelter than a home. It was a place to hide, not to live. Eric had taken to keeping the lights low in the evening. He said it saved electricity, but Miriam knew the truth. Light meant shadows, and shadows moved. The mail slot clattered more often now. Letters, notices, reminders. One week it was a demand to register any books of foreign origin. The next it was a warning about speaking to non-Jewish neighbors. Most of them carried the same threatening tone. dressed up in legal words. They didn't explain much, but they all carried one message: someone was watching. Jacob had disappeared weeks ago, and they had heard nothing since. They didn't ask around. They didn't want to bring attention to themselves. That was what everyone said now: keep your head down, don't attract notice. It was advice passed from family to family like a prayer. One evening, while Miriam was peeling potatoes by the sink, she noticed a man standing across the street. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just reading a newspaper beneath a street lamp. But he stayed there for over an hour. He didn't look up once. When she turned her back and then looked again, he was gone. She told Eric later. He didn't seem surprised. He only said, "We should assume we're always being watched now." It was no longer just the police or the men in brown uniforms. There were informants everywhere, in stairwells, in shops, in schools. People were reporting each other for small things: a spoken word, a casual comment, a complaint overheard. No one knew who to trust. Sometimes, it was someone close. Sometimes, it was someone you'd barely noticed before. The building's caretaker, Herr Weiss, had once been friendly. He used to fix their sink without asking for payment. Now he avoided eye contact in the hallway. One morning, Miriam heard him speaking softly to a man in uniform just outside their door. She pressed her ear to the wood. She could only catch one phrase: "They've taken in someone else." A few days later, they received a visit. Two plainclothes officers knocked quietly and asked to see identification. They said it was routine. They wanted to confirm who lived in the apartment. Eric showed their papers. Miriam stayed still, her hands folded, her eyes calm. The officers glanced around, wrote something down, and left. They said nothing about Jacob, even though they must have known he had been staying with them before his disappearance. After they left, Miriam sat down and began removing anything from the walls that might seem suspicious. A postcard from Amsterdam. An old photograph of her grandfather in a prayer shawl. A page of Hebrew blessings. It wasn't that these things were illegal, not yet. But they might raise questions. And questions were dangerous. Even the children had learned to be careful. David stopped waving to the fruit vendor who used to give him small candies. Lee walked straight home from school without speaking to anyone. Their innocence had become a liability, something to guard and control. They weren't children anymore, not in the eyes of the state. School had become a place of quiet punishment. Lee was moved to a smaller class with only Jewish students. The teacher never smiled. The lessons were shortened and repeated often, as if they weren't worth learning. David's classroom had been relocated to the basement of another building. The walls were damp, and the chairs were broken. They were told not to complain. One afternoon, David returned home with a paper folded in his coat. It was a note from a teacher, accusing him of disruptive behavior. When Eric asked what he had done, David said he had asked a question. He had asked why they couldn't borrow library books like the other children. The next day, a man in uniform came to the door and asked to speak to Eric privately. He stood in the doorway and said that complaints had been filed. Eric nodded. He apologized. He thanked the man and promised it wouldn't happen again. When the man left, he didn't close the gate behind him. That small detail stayed in Eric's mind for the rest of the night. At synagogue, attendance had nearly vanished. The building stood quiet most days, with only a few elderly men sitting in the back pews. The rabbi still came, but he no longer gave sermons. He lit candles and sat in silence, offering a place for anyone who still needed one. Miriam visited once a week. She stayed no longer than 15 minutes. The moment she stepped outside, she looked both ways. Not for traffic, for eyes. The neighbors across the hall, once friendly, now kept their door closed at all times. Miriam hadn't seen them in weeks. But she knew they were still there. She could hear them whispering late at night. One day, she found a broken plate left outside their door with a note tucked beneath it. "Be careful what your boy says at school." It wasn't signed. That evening, Eric sat with David and talked to him gently. He asked him not to speak about anything at school. Not about their prayers. Not about their food. Not about who visited. Not about anything that happened in their home. David looked confused. "Why can't I tell the truth?" "Because truth is no longer safe," Eric said. The worst part was not knowing what would happen next. There were no clear rules. Each week brought something new, another restriction, another letter, another visit. And there was no pattern to the punishments. Some families disappeared after a single mistake. Others survived quietly for months before someone knocked on their door. Miriam began keeping a journal. Not of events. Of feelings. She wrote about fear, about silence, about the weight of pretending everything was normal. She hid the pages in the lining of her coat. If anyone found them, she would burn them. But for now, they were her way of remembering she still had a voice. One night, they heard a crash in the hallway. Eric opened the door and saw that someone had smashed a glass bottle against their threshold. It was late. No one else came out. No one asked if they were all right. The next morning, the building's caretaker was already sweeping it away. He didn't speak to them. That was how it went. A life of watching and being watched. Of listening carefully, of moving quietly, of trusting no one. Even laughter became rare. Lee once giggled at a joke her brother told. Miriam shushed her immediately. Not because the joke was wrong, but because someone might hear. It was a world of closed windows and turned heads. Of quiet meals and locked drawers. Of secrets shared in whispers and questions left unanswered. Still, they kept going. Because that was all they could do. Part 7. Names Removed. It began with a directory. Not an announcement. Not a speech. Just a new edition of the city's official phone book. Smaller than the year before. Fewer pages. Missing names. The Rosenfeld family didn't have a copy, but a neighbor across the courtyard showed Miriam. "Look," she whispered, flipping through the brittle pages. "They're just gone." Whole families, long-standing businesses, well-known professionals, their entries erased. Not marked or labeled. Simply missing. As if they had never lived there at all. Miriam turned to the page where their shoe shop used to be listed. It was blank. The space had collapsed. Rosenfeld, Eric, gone. The feeling wasn't just sadness. It was something stranger. Being removed without a sound. Not challenged. Not debated. Just quietly erased. That's what the government had started doing. Making people disappear from paper before making them disappear in life. Eric sat with the old phone book that evening, comparing the names to what he remembered from a year ago. Half the listings were missing from their neighborhood. Doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, families that had sent their children to school with David and Lee just a year before. Some had left the country. Others had moved in with relatives. Some had been taken away. What does it mean if your name is no longer written? Lee asked when she saw her father reading in silence. "It means someone wants the world to forget you existed," he said gently. "But we're still here." Eric closed the book and met her eyes. "Yes. And that's why it matters." A few days later, their family name disappeared from another place, the school registry. David had been attending his limited classes in the damp basement of a nearby building. One morning, he was stopped at the door by a man he didn't recognize. The man carried a clipboard and told him he wasn't listed anymore. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. not unkindly. David returned home with his books still in his satchel. His eyes were wide. "They said I don't go to school now," he told his mother. Miriam walked to the building herself later that afternoon. She asked to speak to someone in charge. A clerk at a desk told her the decision came from the education office. Jewish students were being reassigned. Where? He didn't know. She could fill out a form and wait for a reply. They never received one. Lee's school followed a few weeks later. Her name was gone from the seating list. A new student had taken her place. She hadn't been told beforehand. Her books were left in her old locker. No one returned them. Miriam didn't argue. She took both children home and told them quietly, "We will learn here now." She found old workbooks, paper scraps, a handful of pencils worn to their ends. They set up lessons around the kitchen table. It wasn't ideal, but it gave the children structure, a sense of normal. Eric taught math when he could. Miriam read aloud from books that hadn't been banned yet. They avoided questions about what other children were doing. Around the same time, new lists were posted at city offices. Property owners, trade license holders, artists, musicians. Those marked as Jewish were either removed or had red lines drawn through their entries. Some names were crossed out by hand. Others were simply missing. Notices followed by mail. The letter Eric received was brief. It stated that the space he once used for his shoe shop was now under review by the city. They were terminating his right to lease the property. No compensation. No appeal. The door had been locked weeks ago, but now it was official. His life's work was no longer his. Not even in memory. He walked by the building a few days later and saw that the sign above the door had been taken down. The lettering scraped off. The shop was still empty, but the window had been cleaned. It looked as if no one had ever worked there. His father's photograph had once hung above the counter. Eric didn't know what had happened to it. He chose not to ask. Back at home, Miriam began noticing changes on official papers. Their surname was being shortened or misspelled more often. Sometimes it was left off entirely. City bills were now addressed to resident. The ration cards listed only numbers. No names. Even the synagogue registry had been edited. She saw it during a quiet visit one morning. Names of families who had worshipped for generations had been blacked out. Not with care. Not with purpose. Just crossed out with thick, careless ink. "I think they want us to forget ourselves," she said to Eric that night. He didn't disagree. One evening, they received a visit from a man claiming to be from the Civil Records Office. He carried a satchel full of forms and asked to see their papers. Not unusual. Not anymore. He sat at the table, compared birth records and family documents. Then, with a red pen, he drew a line through one of their registration forms. "You'll be filed under the new list now," he said. "What list is that?" Eric asked. The man didn't answer. He packed up and left. After he was gone, Miriam picked up the paper and stared at the red line. It ran across their last name like a wound. Below it, a number had been added. The next week, they received ration cards that included only those numbers. No names. Just a household code and date of issue. At the collection center, Jewish families were herded into a separate line. No one spoke. Guards stood nearby, watching. When Miriam stepped forward to hand over the card, the clerk looked past her without speaking. He handed over a small bag of flour and a can of beans. That was the week's share. The card was stamped verified. The number had replaced her name. In the months that followed, the changes moved faster. Street directories removed all Jewish households from public view. Employment records were cleansed. Birth announcements from Jewish families were no longer printed in newspapers. Marriages were erased from church records. Obituaries were denied publication. It was more than exclusion. It was deletion. At the library, the card catalogue had been reorganized. Jewish authors were no longer filed. Books by Jewish scholars were pulled from shelves. Some were quietly burned. Others vanished without mention. Miriam went one last time to find a book she remembered from childhood. She knew it would be gone, but she looked anyway. The space where it had once sat was empty. The shelf had been relabeled. No sign the book had ever existed. Even the cemetery changed. A friend from the synagogue told her that older Jewish graves were being quietly removed from city records. Maps were being redrawn. Stone markers were missing or replaced. Families that returned to honor their dead found blank spaces or broken markers. When Miriam visited her grandfather's grave that autumn, she found the path to his section blocked by a pile of brush and stone. She didn't try to move it. She stood in silence at the edge of the path and whispered his name. Names were all they had left. One cold morning, Lee opened a book she had borrowed from another family. Inside the cover, someone had written in faded pencil, "If they forget us, speak our names aloud." She showed it to her mother. Miriam read the line again and again. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the table with a sheet of paper and began writing names. Her parents, Eric's parents, Jacob, friends, neighbors, people from the synagogue, families who had already vanished. She didn't explain why she was doing it. She didn't need to. Eric joined her. He took a pencil and began his own list. The pages filled slowly. They didn't rush. Each name was written carefully, clearly, as if saying the names aloud with every stroke. They didn't know what would happen to those lists, but writing them down made the people real again, made them exist. Because in a world where names were being removed, holding on to them became an act of survival. Part 8. When the doctors vanished. For a long time, they still trusted the doctors. Even as shops were smashed and schools closed their doors. Even after names were crossed out and homes were taken. Even then, people still believed that the doctors, especially the Jewish ones, were safe. That medicine, if nothing else, would remain untouched. Doctors had healed the wounded after the last war. They had delivered babies, treated fevers, calmed frightened mothers. They had stitched wounds and soothed pain. They had been part of the fabric of every neighborhood. Many families, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, had trusted the same physician for years. Dr. Hirsch was one of those doctors. He had been part of the Rosenfelds' lives for more than a decade. He treated Eric's father when his lungs began to fail. He delivered both David and Lee. He came when David had the cough that wouldn't go away, when Lee broke her arm falling from a garden wall. He always wore a long grey coat and carried a black bag with worn handles. His eyes were kind, and his voice never rushed. He made house calls when others stopped. He stayed late in his small office even when patients were few. He had once served as a field medic during the Great War. There was still a scar on his left hand from a bayonet wound. People respected him. Then one day, he was gone. No announcement. No farewell. His office was simply locked. A sheet of paper, nailed to the door, said, "Closed by order of the state." The neighborhood woke up to find a wall of silence where his practice had stood. Miriam walked there with David that morning. He had been coughing again. The sign flapped in the wind. The windows were shuttered. Miriam knocked once, out of habit. No answer. She stood there for a long time. David coughed quietly into his scarf. Later that afternoon, another mother knocked at their door. Her child had a fever. She asked if Miriam had heard anything, where Dr. Hirsch might have gone. Miriam could only shake her head. By the end of the week, 3 more Jewish doctors in their district had disappeared. Offices closed. Signs taken down. Medical records gone. Rumors filled the silence. Some said the doctors had been sent to labor camps. Others said they had been banned from practicing medicine entirely. A few whispered that some had been arrested in the night. No trials. No explanations. One notice in the newspaper explained it this way: Jewish medical professionals may no longer treat German citizens. The language was clean, administrative, deceptively simple. It didn't say where those doctors would go. It didn't say who would take care of the people left behind. Miriam reread the line again and again. May no longer treat German citizens. It meant that Jews were now cut off from doctors, not just as patients, but as practitioners. It meant that people like Dr. Hirsch, who had dedicated their lives to healing others, were now officially unwanted. Eric sat quietly that evening, staring at a chipped mug of tea. He helped my father when no one else could, he said softly. He helped everyone, Miriam answered. The city began publishing lists. Certified physicians. Approved clinics. Names of those authorized to provide care. No Jewish names appeared on those lists. At hospitals, new signs were posted. This institution serves only citizens of Aryan descent. Jewish patients were turned away, even in emergencies. Some hospitals refused to accept ambulances carrying Jewish patients. Others took them in, only to place them in side rooms with no treatment. A woman at the synagogue had gone into labor early. Her husband rushed her to the nearest hospital, only to be told they would not admit her. They were sent to a smaller clinic far across the city. By the time they arrived, the baby had died. The mother survived, barely. Another man, a tailor who had collapsed in the street, was denied care because his identification card bore the red J. Bystanders called for help. The ambulance came, but the staff never opened the door. The news of such stories passed quietly, from family to family, like shared breaths in the dark. Miriam kept a list in her coat pocket of the few remaining doctors who still dared to treat Jews in secret. Some were non-Jewish and working underground. Others were retired physicians taking risks out of principle. The list was short. It grew shorter each week. When David's cough worsened, Miriam took him to one of those names, an elderly woman named Dr. Weiss who lived above a bakery in the south of the city. Her practice was hidden. Appointments were made only through whispered conversations. Payment was often refused or passed in envelopes beneath coats. Dr. Weiss had trembling hands but steady eyes. She examined David gently, her breath shallow from age, but her touch sure. His lungs are clear, she said after listening. But you need to keep him warm. And away from the factory smoke. It's thicker this month. She gave them a small bottle of syrup and a warning to return if things worsened. Miriam thanked her again and again. She wanted to say more, to offer something, to express the weight of her gratitude. But the hallway was narrow, and another patient waited just behind the curtain. They slipped out the back entrance and didn't speak until they were 4 blocks away. You think she'll be safe? David asked. Miriam didn't answer right away. I hope so, she finally said. At home, Lee had begun studying basic medicine from an old book Eric had once used during his service. She read about how to clean wounds, how to treat a fever, how to set a bone. It gave her something to do, and something to feel useful. Miriam watched her and said nothing. She was proud and terrified. Letters came, as always. One arrived in June ordering all Jews with medical degrees to surrender their licenses. They were no longer permitted to identify themselves as doctors, even privately. Medical equipment was to be turned over. Prescription rights revoked. Violators would face prison. Another letter told Jewish families not to seek care from German doctors without a permit. Permits were not being granted. One day, a man knocked at the apartment door carrying a box and a clipboard. He said he was collecting supplies on behalf of the state. Eric handed over a few old gauze rolls and a thermometer. The man inspected them and made a note. Before leaving, he said, "Your file shows someone in this home was treated last month. Is that correct?" Miriam's throat tightened. "Yes," she said. "Our son. We used family remedies." The man paused, then nodded once. "Good." He didn't check the box. He didn't press further. But the next day, someone followed Eric for 4 blocks on his way to the market. It wasn't an accident. From then on, Miriam kept David's medicine hidden in a hollow wall behind a loose tile. One night, a woman they knew from the synagogue came knocking. Her husband had cut his hand badly while repairing furniture. The bleeding wouldn't stop. She asked if they had any cloth, any antiseptic, anything. Eric gave her what he could. Miriam gave her a small bottle of boiled water and instructions from Lee's book. They never heard what happened next. Dr. Hirsch's name had once been printed in gold letters on the door to his office. Now the space was empty, the door painted over. Someone said a shoe store would be moving in. Someone else said it would remain vacant as a warning. Miriam kept his business card in her sewing box. She looked at it sometimes when the nights were long. They never found out where he went. Some said he escaped. Some said he didn't. But no matter where he was, he had become part of a new truth, that even the ones who healed had no protection. That kindness, knowledge, and service no longer mattered. And still, families got sick. Babies were born. Infections spread. But the doctors were gone. Part 9. Kristallnacht. The first sign was smoke. It drifted low through the alleyways, weaving between chimneys and rooftops, long before anyone could see where it came from. On that November night in 1938, the air above Berlin shimmered strangely, not from fog or cold, but from the faint orange glow hanging over the eastern blocks. People noticed, but few stepped outside to look. There was something about the color that made people stay indoors. Eric Rosenfeld stood by the window, still in his shirt sleeves, watching the sky pulse gently as if lit by distant fire. A thin veil of silence had fallen over their street, broken only now and then by the echo of hurried boots or a muffled crash somewhere farther away. It was the kind of quiet that made the skin tighten, the kind that warned of something you couldn't yet see. Earlier that afternoon, rumors had passed through the synagogue like drifting smoke. There had been an incident in Paris. A German official had been shot. The boy responsible was said to be Jewish. Some worshippers left early. Others stayed, seated stiffly, their eyes on the windows instead of the Torah. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, but everyone felt it. Around midnight, the first sound of glass breaking reached their block. It came from the tailor's shop at the corner, a sharp pop followed by the unmistakable scattering of shattered panes. Within minutes, more crashes followed, like dominoes toppling in the dark. Furniture was being overturned. Doors were kicked open. Angry voices shouted across alleyways and down stairwells. There were no arguments or warnings, only destruction. David clutched a blanket and crawled beneath the table. Lee sat against the wall with her arms wrapped around her knees. Miriam began lighting candles with steady hands. Her fingers shook only after the flames caught. Eric slid the lock across their front door and moved the bookshelf just enough to block it. He said nothing, but he didn't leave that spot for the rest of the night. They remained like that until the sky began to pale. Not one of them slept. By morning, the streets had been transformed. Their familiar neighborhood, where bakeries once opened with the scent of warm bread and neighbors nodded on their way to the tram, looked like it had survived a storm made by human hands. Glass covered the pavement in jagged islands. Burnt paper fluttered in the gutters. Storefronts gaped open like wounds, their signs ripped down or marked with slurs in thick black paint. The synagogue on the corner had been set ablaze. Its roof had collapsed in the night, leaving a scorched skeleton behind. Prayer books lay in the street, waterlogged and torn, their pages trampled into the mud. A Torah scroll had been split down the middle, its parchment curling like bark peeled from a tree. Eric stood beside the wreckage of his old shop, unable to step any closer. The walls were still standing, but everything inside had been stripped or broken. A single shoe lay overturned by the doorway. Across the facade, someone had painted a swastika and the words, "You're not welcome here anymore." Neighbors walked quickly past the destruction. Faces lowered, eyes fixed forward. Many had seen the flames the night before but hadn't called for help. The fire brigade never came. No police arrived to stop the looting. By noon, printed bulletins began appearing. They called the damage a reaction of the people. Official statements used careful language: spontaneous, justified, necessary. There was no mention of who had led the attacks, or how they had known exactly which addresses to target. Photographs appeared in newspapers the next morning. They showed the smoldering ruins of synagogues and smashed shopfronts, but the captions offered no sympathy. Instead, they praised German resolve and condemned international provocation. The people reading those pages were not asked to feel sorrow. They were asked to feel proud. Miriam read one of those articles 3 times before tearing it into pieces. The wave of destruction had not been confined to Berlin. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues were burned, Jewish homes were ransacked, and families were dragged from their beds. In nearly every major city, the same scenes repeated. Buildings set alight while bystanders watched in silence. The name people gave to those 2 nights came later. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. As if shattered windows had been the greatest harm. But it wasn't the glass that would be remembered. It was the way people vanished. Early the next morning, uniformed officers appeared in doorways with typed lists in hand. They asked for men by name. They did not explain why. The charges were never read. The reason didn't matter. In every apartment they entered, fear rushed in behind them. Isaac, Eric's cousin, was taken before sunrise. His wife had pleaded with the officers, begging for 5 minutes to gather his coat. They refused. He left wearing slippers, his hands still marked with the ink from his bookkeeping work. No one said where he was being taken. Later, a friend said they saw him at the train station, surrounded by others. Men packed into a line, hands behind their backs. The Rosenfelds weren't touched that day, but their building lost 3 men before noon. Their names were never published. Their families stopped answering the door. More letters came within the week. None offered apology. The Jewish community, according to the WWII, would now be held responsible for the damage caused during the events. A fine was issued, 1 billion Reichsmarks, a number too large to understand, spread across families already made poor by bans and boycotts. They also received a personal notice. Eric was expected to cover the cost of cleaning up what was left of his store. The wreckage created by those who had destroyed it was now his burden to remove. When Miriam read the letter, she said nothing at first. Then she folded it once, set it on the table, and left the room. Not long after, new restrictions arrived. Jews could no longer own businesses. Licenses were revoked without hearings. Bank accounts were frozen or closed. Insurance claims were rejected. There would be no compensation for what had been lost. Not the buildings, not the goods, not the memories. What had taken generations to build was erased in 2 nights. Lee stopped asking to go outside. David refused to walk past the ruined synagogue, even with his eyes closed. In their home, Miriam covered the windows more carefully. Eric kept a packed bag beneath the bed, though he didn't speak of it. The children whispered now, even in play. It wasn't caution anymore. It had become habit. The brown shirts no longer needed to patrol. The fear did their work for them. When you live with the sound of shattering glass in your memory, you start to move differently. You speak less. You wait longer before turning on a light. You hold your breath when someone knocks. Not because you expect safety, but because you're not sure if it's the moment you'll be taken to. Kristallnacht was not a single night. It was a door flung open. What followed would no longer be hidden behind polite language or slow changes. Now, the world had seen what the Reich was capable of, and had mostly stayed silent. Part 10. Burned Words. The fires had moved on from buildings. Now they came for pages. In the early months of 1939, the campaign against Jewish life in Germany took a quieter form. It no longer came with broken windows or painted slogans. Instead, it arrived in crates and barrels, in city squares and school courtyards, where the words themselves were fed to the flames. Miriam Rosenfeld heard about the first public book burning in a whisper passed down from a young boy at synagogue. He had watched men in uniform toss volumes into a bonfire the size of a carriage. Not just newspapers or pamphlets, but real books, thick, bound, loved. The titles were shouted aloud before being destroyed. Some in the crowd clapped. Others turned away. The boy didn't cry when he told the story, but his hands shook. News spread quickly after that. Bookshops were being raided. Libraries were emptied overnight. Entire shelves vanished without a sound. Stories once carried by generations were now vanishing in smoke. When Eric came home with soot on his collar, Miriam asked what had happened. "They took everything from the school's reading room," he said. "Every Jewish author. Every foreign name. And the others." They watched. In some parts of the city, officials claimed the books had simply been relocated for cataloguing. But the truth was easier to find in the ashes left behind. Even the children's section of the local library had been purged. David and Lee had once spent quiet afternoons there, their fingers brushing the spines of stories they weren't old enough to understand. Now, the shelves were filled only with approved titles, state-published history texts, biographies of party leaders, and books that praised a narrow version of the world. At home, the Rosenfelds kept their few remaining books hidden in an old trunk beneath the bed. Wrapped in cloth, they included prayer books, a worn copy of the Brothers Grimm, a Hebrew-German dictionary, and a volume of Goethe that Eric's mother had given him years ago. There was nothing dangerous in those pages. No calls to rebellion. No politics. Just memories. But memories had become dangerous. Miriam spent one whole afternoon sewing a false bottom into the trunk, in case it was ever opened. She lined the inside with dark fabric and nailed a wooden board over the top, disguising it as a box of winter clothes. "That's not protection," Eric had said. "No," she answered, "but it's a chance." The new laws didn't only affect libraries. Schools were ordered to revise their curriculums. Jewish perspectives were to be erased from history lessons. Literature written by Jewish authors was banned entirely. Music composed by Jewish artists could no longer be performed. Even science textbooks were rewritten, removing credit from Jewish physicists and mathematicians. Eric remembered sitting in the back of his school as a boy, listening to his teacher speak about Einstein with wonder. Now, Einstein's name was spoken only in hatred. He had been labeled a traitor to the German people. His work was declared Jewish physics and removed from every syllabus. Lee returned from her underground school one day, holding a crumpled sheet of paper. It was a copied poem, handed out secretly by a teacher. The ink was faded, the edges torn. The writer's name had been removed. "We're not allowed to know who wrote it," she explained. But we're allowed to read it?" Miriam asked. "We're allowed to read it only if we don't say it aloud." That sentence stayed with Miriam for days. They had lived under restrictions before. They had faced insults, loss of work, even fear. But this new silence, the stripping away of thoughts and stories, felt different. It was not only their bodies that were being confined. Now, their minds were under siege. Even religious texts came under attack. Torah scrolls were stolen from synagogues, paraded through the streets, and burned in the public square. The sacred was mocked. The holy was made into fuel. At the city center, a pile of religious books had been stacked like firewood. People passed by without looking. Miriam remembered the night she found her grandfather's prayer book in the closet. It had been tucked behind old jars and a cracked mirror. She held it carefully, running her fingers along the edge of the leather cover. Inside, the margins were filled with tiny notes in pencil, small reflections, questions, and sometimes jokes written in Hebrew script. Her grandfather had carried it through war, through hunger, through exile. She didn't show it to the children. Instead, she wrapped it in cloth and placed it beside the others. They no longer said blessings at the window. Candles were lit in secret. Hebrew was whispered. Psalms were recited beneath breath. Miriam worried that if her children forgot the words, it would not be their fault. It would be the fault of a world trying to erase them. One morning, Eric returned from a walk holding a single page torn from a newspaper. He placed it on the table and pointed to a notice at the bottom. A list of authors whose works were now officially outlawed. Kafka, Heine, Marx, Freud. Names they had grown up with. Ideas that had shaped the last century. The state declared them corrosive to the German spirit. Miriam scanned the list. Some names she recognized. Others were unfamiliar. It didn't matter. The message was the same. Knowledge was no longer welcome unless it served the state. Soon after, a knock came at the door. Not an officer this time, a neighbor. The woman was holding a stack of books in her arms. She looked pale, nervous, eyes darting down the hall. "I'm sorry to ask," she said, "but will you take these?" Miriam hesitated. "Why us?" "I can't keep them anymore. If they find them, I thought maybe you'd understand." The books were not religious. They weren't even political. A novel about a family by the sea. A medical guide. A volume of poetry. But the authors were Jewish. That was enough. Miriam took them in silence and waited until the hallway was clear before closing the door. That night, she added the volumes to their hidden trunk. She didn't open them. She didn't need to. The pages still carried weight, even unread. On Fridays, she began reading aloud to the children again. Not the laws. Not the news. Just stories. Fairy tales and fables. They changed the names, set the tales in distant lands. She made sure the children understood the deeper meaning, even if they didn't say it aloud. "These are old stories," she told them, "but they still belong to us." Lee asked one night, "What happens when all the books are gone?" Miriam looked at her daughter, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. "Then we become the books," she said. They began memorizing passages, little by little. Lines from the Psalms. Phrases from old novels. Songs their grandparents used to sing. They recited them in the kitchen while peeling potatoes, or while folding laundry. Quietly, gently, like breathing. It wasn't rebellion. It was preservation. Outside, the official world grew louder. Speeches filled the airwaves. Radio broadcasts repeated slogans. Posters covered the walls. Every message sounded the same: loyalty, purity, order. Nothing questioned. Nothing doubted. There was only one way to think. The Rosenfelds, like many others, lived in the spaces in between. They didn't shout. They didn't protest. But they remembered. In a world where libraries were locked and knowledge was punished, remembering became a form of resistance. And holding on to words, even in silence, became an act of survival. Part 11. Ghettos of Silence. There was no line painted on the road. No wall raised overnight. No public decree announcing the change. And yet, one day, the Rosenfelds found themselves living in a different kind of neighborhood, one that had been quietly turned into a cage. The city didn't use the word ghetto at first. That term would come later, and when it did, it would carry with it images of fences, guards, and locked gates. But in early 1939, separation arrived in subtler forms. It took shape through orders and numbers, folded papers, and narrowed streets. The Rosenfeld family had already been forced out of their old apartment 6 months earlier. Their new home stood in a crowded block filled almost entirely with other Jewish families. The buildings were older here. The plumbing groaned. The light was weaker through the windows. What had once been a mixed part of town had been slowly and carefully emptied, not by violence, but by quiet pressure. One building at a time, the non-Jewish tenants had moved out, or been told to. The postman no longer came to the door. Deliveries were left at the edge of the street. Official services grew slower, then stopped altogether. Trash piled up in the alleys. Repairs went unfinished. The neighborhood began to feel forgotten. It wasn't forgotten. It had been marked. David noticed first. He asked why they no longer saw people who didn't know Hebrew. Why his classmates from the old school never waved anymore. Why the buses no longer stopped nearby. Miriam tried to soften the truth, but her answers were met with silence. Lee didn't ask questions. She had already seen the signs. Officially, the city claimed these changes were part of a new housing policy. Jewish residents were to be concentrated in designated areas for easier management and cultural cohesion. The letters used words like efficiency and safety. They avoided the truth. In practice, it meant one thing: Jews were being shut out of the rest of the city. When the Rosenfelds needed flour, they had to walk to a specific shop with limited hours. When Miriam required thread or soap, she stood in line with a ration card that no longer matched the numbers printed on public forms. The shops that accepted those cards were vanishing. The choices grew smaller each week. A single butcher served the entire block now. He worked in silence, slicing meat behind a cracked window. Customers passed notes instead of speaking. No one wanted to draw attention. Rumors spread that he'd been warned by local officers. If he stepped outside the neighborhood to sell, he'd be punished. Mail delivery was now restricted to twice a month. Most letters never arrived. When they did, they were often opened already. Pages missing. Paragraphs crossed out. Sometimes, only the envelope remained. Miriam stopped writing altogether. Instead, she spoke in whispers to neighbors in stairwells. She shared bread with a family below them. Eric fixed a broken chair for the family above. There was a quiet cooperation among the residents, a shared understanding that none of them could survive alone. Still, the isolation pressed in. The tram lines no longer ran nearby. Taxis refused to enter the district. Even bicycles were discouraged. Those caught leaving the neighborhood without permission were detained or fined. Some were sent away without warning. Lee witnessed one such arrest. A young man she had once seen delivering groceries tried to cross the main avenue to visit a cousin. A uniformed officer stopped him. There was no argument, no scene. The officer whispered something in his ear, then led him away by the elbow. He didn't return. Miriam kept the children inside for 2 days after that. Even the air began to feel different. As spring turned to summer, the streets seemed too still. Laughter disappeared. Conversations became shorter. Voices dropped whenever a stranger passed by. The only sound that remained consistent was the creak of windows opening and closing, like breaths being held and released. Every few weeks, new families arrived, sent from other parts of the city. They came with bundles, suitcases, tired eyes. Rooms were shared. Beds divided. Privacy vanished. Eric helped a woman find a spare blanket. Miriam gave a child her last orange. There was no space to spare, but they shared what they could. The walls of their building grew thinner. Arguments echoed across the floors. Babies cried through the night. Still, no one complained. Everyone knew what had brought them there, and what could come next. David had begun drawing again. He used bits of charcoal from the stove to sketch on torn scraps of newspaper. His drawings were simple: houses, trees, animals. One evening, Miriam found a drawing of a bird with no wings, sitting behind a window. She didn't ask him about it. She simply folded the page and placed it in a drawer. Lee spent more time reading aloud to her brother. Stories helped pass the hours. They became a kind of bridge, a way to remember a world that felt farther away with each passing day. On Fridays, Miriam still lit candles. Not near the window. Not where anyone could see. Just 2 small flames in the corner of the kitchen. The blessings were whispered. The meal was modest. But for a moment, it brought the room back to life. They never called it a ghetto. Not then. But by the end of that year, the borders around their lives had become visible. Not fences. Not walls. Just limits, where you could walk, what you could carry, who you could speak to, where you could sit, what you could buy, when you were allowed to exist in the public world. The silence grew deeper. One night, Eric stood on the steps of their building, looking up at the stars. A patrol passed by, and he stepped back into the shadows. Even the sky, it seemed, had become something to hide from. Part 12. Trying to flee. There was a time when the idea of leaving Germany felt unthinkable. Even after the shops were boycotted and the schools were taken away. Even after books were burned and friends disappeared. Still, many families held on, convinced that reason would return. They had built lives here. Spoken the language. Served in its wars. Contributed to its culture. Germany had been home for generations. Leaving felt like a betrayal of roots. But by 1939, hope no longer stood between them and the border. Only paperwork did. Eric and Miriam Rosenfeld had never traveled beyond Germany's edges. Their parents had neither. Their lives had always fit neatly within the train lines and city maps. But now, with jobs gone, names struck from documents, and the children forbidden from school, it became clear that staying might not be survivable. The first step was to find a country willing to accept them. That alone was nearly impossible. Miriam began writing letters in the early morning, when the house was still quiet. She addressed them to embassies, consulates, organizations she had only heard of in whispers. Each envelope carried a version of the same desperate message. We are for, we are peaceful, we will work, we will not be a burden. They waited for replies that rarely came. The few that arrived offered sympathy without solutions. Visa quotas had been filled. Travel restrictions were tightening. Economic uncertainty made governments cautious. And beneath the surface of every rejection was the unspoken truth. They were Jewish, and that made them someone else's problem. A friend mentioned a cousin who had made it to Argentina. Another heard that England was accepting children, but not families. Some whispered about Cuba, or Shanghai. It felt as though the world had turned into a map of closed doors. Each one locked a second before they reached it. Eric made a trip to the American consulate in person. He waited in line for nearly 6 hours, holding a folder of papers, birth certificates, marriage license, old letters of reference, school records for Lee and David. When he finally reached the window, the man behind the glass glanced over the documents and said nothing for several minutes. Then, quietly, he said, "You'll need a financial guarantor inside the United States." Eric nodded. "We don't know anyone there." "I'm sorry," the man replied. "Without that, we can't proceed." They walked home slowly that night. The city around them buzzed with spring rain. Every step felt heavier. Eric folded the documents and slipped them inside his coat, as if keeping them close would protect their last chance. The next day, Miriam visited a travel agent's office in a quieter part of town. The windows were clean. A globe spun slowly behind the front desk. She stood in line with others who wore the same weary expression, not quite panic, not yet despair, but a numb urgency. When it was her turn, she asked for help booking passage to anywhere that would take them. The agent didn't even glance up. "Jews must obtain exit permits before I can speak to them," he said. "Can you tell me how to get one?" "That's not my department," he replied, and turned to the next customer. Exit permits had become a weapon of bureaucracy, issued only with proof of emigration visas, and those visas granted only with evidence of foreign sponsors, jobs, or affidavits. The process was circular, a trap of forms that led back to the beginning, and every delay could cost weeks. Other families were trying too. The stairwells were filled with quiet conversations about cousins in Canada, uncles in South Africa, job offers in Australia. But each story came with warnings, lost applications, rejected papers, missing stamps. One man sold his furniture to bribe an official, only to be denied at the last minute when a policy changed. The Rosenfelds didn't have anything left to sell. Lee asked one evening, "Where would we go?" "Anywhere," Miriam answered. "Anywhere that doesn't ask us to prove we're human." David didn't understand, but he nodded. They began packing anyway, just in case. 2 suitcases, filled slowly over the course of weeks. Miriam wrapped a few books in linens. Eric folded his father's coat. The children placed their drawings, their letters, and a few toys in the bottom of their bags. No one spoke of what they would leave behind, their home, their community, the street where they learned to walk. When the exit tax was announced, they were stunned. To leave Germany, Jews would now be required to pay a large fee, nearly everything they owned. It was called a flight tax, and its purpose was clear: strip them of the life they had built before pushing them out the door. Miriam stared at the notice in silence. They had nothing left. What little savings they had were already frozen. One neighbor sold her wedding ring for half the required amount. Another tried to flee without paying and was arrested. No one knew where he was sent. Rumors whispered of forged documents. Smugglers who could get people to the border. False identities. But these came with risks too high for a family with children. One wrong step could mean separation, or worse. And still, they tried. Eric returned to the American consulate every week, hoping something had changed. He met a man who had received a visa after 3 years of waiting, only to have it revoked at the last moment when his sponsor lost a job. Miriam wrote to an old acquaintance in the Netherlands, asking if she would be willing to vouch for them. Weeks passed with no reply. A letter eventually came, apologizing. Her family was already sheltering others and feared losing their home. The walls around them were not made of bricks or barbed wire. They were made of silence, of absence, of too many unanswered letters. The children stopped asking when they would leave. Lee had begun keeping a diary. She wrote in small, neat lines, folding each page and hiding it behind the loose floorboard beneath her bed. Miriam read one entry by accident and returned it without a word. In it, Lee had written, "If we can't go, I hope someone comes for us." David made a game of pretending to pack for a long journey. He arranged his few possessions into different boxes, pretending he had a choice of destinations. "Today we're going to America," he would say, handing his mother a pretend ticket. The next day it was Denmark. After that, a country with no name. His voice was cheerful, but his eyes stayed on the door. By summer's end, the border checkpoints grew stricter. People were being turned away for missing stamps, incomplete paperwork, or simply for arriving on the wrong day. Some managed to leave. A few families vanished overnight. The lights in their windows never lit again. No one said goodbye. Speaking of escape had become dangerous. Others waited too long. They stood in line with carefully folded documents, only to be told that the quota had closed. That the office was no longer accepting applications. That the rules had changed again. One morning, a young man knocked on the Rosenfeld's door, breathless and soaked from rain. "I heard your name at the registry," he whispered. "Someone is still processing your file in Hamburg. Go now. Take everything." But when they arrived, the office was shuttered. A new name had been painted across the sign. Their file was nowhere to be found. Eric didn't speak the whole train ride home. That night, Miriam folded the children's coats and placed them by the door, not because they were leaving, but because she didn't know what else to do. They had done everything right. And it still hadn't been enough. Part 13. A School Without Friends. Lee Rosenfeld used to enjoy school. Not because of arithmetic, or essays, or neat rows of grammar drills, though she was good at those things. What she loved most was the rhythm of it. The smell of chalk. The sound of shoes echoing in the hallway. The whisper of pages turning just before the bell rang. The way her friends would pass notes folded into tiny squares and giggle behind their hands when the teacher turned to the board. But by the spring of 1939, all of that had disappeared. The school she had once attended was still standing, but her name was no longer written in the attendance book. The desk she had used in the third row had been scrubbed and reassigned. The girl who sat there now didn't know who Lee was. Or if she did, she wouldn't admit it. The WWII had removed Jewish students from public schools with a short, carefully worded order. It cited the need for educational uniformity. Teachers received the instruction without debate. Some read it aloud to their classes. Others avoided eye contact, clearing desks in silence. No formal notice arrived at the Rosenfeld's door. Miriam only found out because a neighbor passed the word. Jewish students were no longer allowed in city classrooms. Lee didn't cry. She had seen it coming. The following week, she joined a makeshift class in the back of an apartment on the third floor of a crumbling building a few streets over. The room smelled of coal and dust. The furniture didn't match. Desks were replaced by crates or planks nailed together. There was no blackboard, only a small slate that had to be shared. Still, the children came. They brought pencils with broken tips, worn books borrowed from relatives, and a quiet determination. Lessons were shorter. Supplies were few. But no one skipped. The teacher, Frau Stein, had once been a university lecturer. She taught now for free, brushing chalk dust from her skirt as she spoke. Her voice was tired but patient. She spoke slowly, as if trying to stretch each lesson across the silence that had grown outside those walls. There were no bells, no uniforms, no playgrounds. Lee learned by copying words into the margins of old newspapers. When she read aloud softly, not because it was required, but because the sound reminded her she was still a student. David sat in a smaller group down the hall. His class met in a kitchen. Their teacher taught arithmetic while kneading bread dough with flour-stained hands. Each lesson came with the unspoken understanding that it could end at any moment. If the wrong person asked questions, if a door was opened too loudly, if someone knocked who wasn't expected, the school would vanish. Miriam took turns watching the stairwell from a chair beside the front window. Other children passed them on the street each morning, dressed in their clean uniforms, swinging their satchels, chatting in groups. They never looked toward the building where the Jewish school met. If they did, their eyes slid away quickly. Lee once spotted a former classmate at the bakery. The girl saw her, paused, then turned without speaking. At first, that kind of silence stung. Then it just became normal. One boy in her class had come from another city, where his parents had already been evicted from their home. He wore shoes too small for his feet and had no coat for winter. When asked to draw a map of Europe, he marked only 2 places, Berlin and the place he used to live. He said he didn't believe in the rest of the world anymore. Another girl stopped attending without warning. Her desk stayed empty for 2 days before the teacher gently asked the others not to speak her name. Everyone understood what that meant. Eric did his best to keep spirits up at home. He asked the children what they had learned each evening, nodding as they explained lessons. Miriam prepared small treats when she could, slices of warm bread with jam, roasted potatoes with salt. The children smiled. They tried to make things easier for their parents, even though no one said so out loud. Lee kept a notebook tucked inside her pillowcase. She wrote down words she liked, expressions she didn't want to forget, questions she had no one to ask. Her handwriting had become tighter, more precise. When Miriam read it in secret, she found a line that stayed with her for days. School used to be a place. Now it's only a feeling. David struggled more. He missed the structure of bells and lunch breaks and games in the yard. His handwriting grew sloppy. He fidgeted during lessons. Once, he asked if the other children still played hide and seek. "They do," Miriam said. "Just not with us." When she visited the underground classroom, she found herself struck by how quiet the children were. They didn't whisper to each other. They didn't fidget or ask to leave early. They sat still, absorbing whatever was offered. Not because they were obedient, but because they knew how fragile this learning had become. The teacher never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Each lesson felt like an act of defiance. Not the kind that drew attention. Just the quiet refusal to disappear. Still, the silence grew heavier. Lee once asked her mother, "When this ends, do you think they'll let us go back?" Miriam didn't have an answer. She kissed her daughter's forehead and said, "I hope they remember we were here." But each day made it harder to believe that. Across the city, former schools became offices, warehouses, storage buildings. Playgrounds were locked. Benches were painted over. The world around them erased their past without noise, without headlines, without hesitation. Even the alphabet began to feel smaller. But in that cramped apartment, with its broken chairs and smudged pages, children still learned. They read, calculated, questioned. They whispered answers and folded notes again. They held on to the belief that one day, someone would want to know what they had seen. And when that day came, they wanted to be able to explain it. Part 14. Faith in Hiding. Long before the laws forbade them, the rituals had already begun to fade from public view. It didn't happen with a sudden command. There was no single moment when synagogues were locked, when prayers were outlawed, when candles were declared forbidden. Instead, faith was forced inward step by step, pressed tighter with each new rule, until what had once been shared openly was reduced to whispers behind drawn curtains. Miriam Rosenfeld still lit candles every Friday evening, but the flames no longer danced in the window for neighbors to see. She kept them low on the table, behind the curtain, in a spot where no light escaped. The blessings were spoken softly. The melodies of old songs, once hummed freely during supper, were now barely audible under the crackle of the stove. She had never thought of faith as something that could be taken. Not entirely. Belief had always lived in words, in gestures, in the rhythm of her family's life. But now she saw how easily it could be pushed underground, not just the rituals themselves, but the space they had once occupied. The Torah scroll from the neighborhood synagogue had survived Kristallnacht by a stroke of luck. A young man had hidden it in a coal shed behind his father's workshop just hours before the building was torched. He wrapped it in cloth and kept it buried for months before passing it to a trusted neighbor. That scroll now sat in a wooden box beneath a false floor in someone's apartment 3 blocks away. It hadn't been unrolled in weeks. No one knew when it would be safe to read from it again. During the Passover that followed, the Rosenfelds held their Seder in silence. The bitter herbs were dried, the matzah baked in secret. Eric read from a handwritten Haggadah copied on scraps of paper. They whispered the questions. Miriam translated the answers. David leaned against her side, watching her mouth move instead of reading the words. There was no wine, no Elijah's cup, but the door stayed unlocked just the same. Eric said it mattered, even if no one could see it. Even if Elijah didn't come. On Yom Kippur, they fasted quietly, speaking only when necessary. Lee read the prayers with her fingers pressed to her lips. When she finished, she tore the page in half and burned it in the stove. Miriam watched the ashes rise with the smoke. The things they had once taken for granted, towelette, mezuzahs, prayer books, yazit candles, had become risks. Even owning such objects could be seen as provocation. During searches, officers often made a point of destroying anything religious first. Scrolls were thrown from shelves. Candlesticks were bent out of shape. Hebrew was treated as evidence. People began to hide what they could. Pages were buried in gardens. Books were sewn into mattresses. Some families painted over Hebrew lettering on the doorposts, covering sacred symbols with gray. Still, there were those who remembered the words by heart, who closed their eyes and repeated verses passed down from grandparents, who taught children the alphabet by drawing letters in steam on the windowpane. Miriam kept a small cloth pouch tied inside her coat. Inside was a folded piece of parchment with her father's favorite psalm written in careful script. She had read it at his funeral. She touched it every morning before lighting the stove, a habit so quiet it no longer felt like a gesture. Just breath, just presence. There were gatherings, still, but they were small, hidden, scattered across the city like broken pieces of stained glass. A group of 5 met in a basement laundry once a month. Another gathered by candlelight in an attic, their prayers timed with the arrival of passing trains to muffle the sound. One evening, Eric was invited to join a hidden minyan. 10 men in a single room. No light, no books, no shared food. Only memory and voice. When he returned home, Miriam asked what they had read. Just one blessing, he said. And then we sat in silence. Sometimes silence was the only offering they had left. Children were the ones who carried the heaviest part of this secrecy. They were old enough to understand fear, but too young to accept its terms. David asked why he couldn't wear his kippah anymore. Miriam told him it was safer to keep it hidden. He nodded, but the next morning she found it folded beneath his pillow like a secret he couldn't throw away. Lee stopped asking to study Torah. She read poetry instead. She wrote in a notebook with no names, no dates, no place to belong. Still, they held on to what they could. On one particularly cold evening, Miriam lit 2 matches and let the flames burn longer than necessary before lighting the Shabbat candles. The warmth stayed on her fingers long after the matchstick crumbled. Eric noticed and said nothing. She needed that moment. They all did. A neighbor lost his father and wanted to say Kaddish. He stood in the stairwell for nearly an hour before 3 other men appeared. They didn't speak. They didn't embrace. They stood close enough to hear each other's breath, recited the prayer once, then parted without a word. That kind of mourning, quiet, incomplete, but still sacred, became the new way of life. No ceremony. No burial stones. Just memory carried from one apartment to another. There were no rabbis left nearby. Most had fled or been taken. The ones who remained did so without title or safety. They visited homes under false names, gave blessings behind closed doors, and taught children with no materials but their voice. Faith had changed shape. It no longer belonged to buildings or books. It lived in folded hands, in eyes that closed at the right moment, in breath held during the pause between 2 verses. It existed in shadows and silence, and somehow it endured. Miriam believed that was the hardest part for those who hated them. They could take names, homes, jobs, and paper. But they couldn't stop belief. Not completely. That was the one thing no law could erase. Part 15. The Edge of the Abyss. The summer of 1939 arrived without celebration. No parades. No music in the parks. No laughter carried on the breeze. For the Rosenfeld family, and the hundreds of others now crammed into the silent corners of Berlin, the warmth of the season felt wrong. The sun still rose, the trees still bloomed, but life beneath that brightness had narrowed to a single question. What would happen next? Rumors arrived before official notices. People said a war was coming. Some believed it would begin in the east. Others claimed the border with Poland had already been breached in secret. Most didn't pretend to know. But the fear was constant, a quiet hum beneath every conversation. In their building, voices dropped even lower. Doors opened more slowly. The children played in complete silence. One morning, Eric stood by the kitchen window with his hands resting on the sill. A long line of trucks moved down the main road, heading west. Soldiers stood in the backs of the vehicles, staring straight ahead. The uniforms were crisp. The faces expressionless. The people on the sidewalk didn't cheer or wave. They just stepped aside. When Eric sat down at the table, Miriam passed him a cup of tea without asking what he'd seen. No one needed to name the direction of history anymore. It had become clear. In early August, the city issued new identity documents. These were not simply updated forms or replacement cards. The papers now had thick red borders and an unmistakable stamp. J. Every Jew in Germany was required to carry the marked pass at all times. Anyone caught without it would be detained. The new regulation wasn't just about documentation. It was about separation. The label made it impossible to hide. It turned every street into a test. Every checkpoint into a risk. Even the smallest mistake, stepping outside at the wrong hour, entering the wrong shop, forgetting the paper at home, could mean arrest. Lee, now 13, had to register for a special ID of her own. She signed her name carefully, even though the document would no longer represent her. David asked why they needed to be identified if everyone already knew. Miriam gave no answer. There wasn't one. The air changed again in September. War was no longer something that might happen. It had begun. Germany invaded Poland. The radio broadcasts were full of victory speeches. The voice of the Führer rang out across every station, declaring triumph and destiny. Loudspeakers were installed in public squares. Flags were raised. Marching songs filled the air. But there were no celebrations inside the Jewish quarter. Families gathered quietly. Some wept. Others simply sat, unmoving, as if waiting for the next piece to fall. The Rosenfelds still had not received an emigration visa. Their final application had been returned stamped denied. No explanation, no further opportunity. Miriam folded the paper and placed it beneath her mattress. It was the last response they would receive from any consulate. Escape was no longer an option. That autumn, restrictions intensified further. Jewish residents were forbidden to own radios. Those who had them were forced to surrender the devices within 3 days. Posters warned of severe consequences for anyone caught listening to foreign broadcasts. The Rosenfelds handed theirs in without argument. The silence that followed was worse than expected. Without news, the world felt farther away. They could no longer hear what was happening in the cities beyond Berlin. No stories of survival, no messages from those who had escaped, no whispers of resistance. Just the quiet hum of isolation. Markets were shut off to Jewish families entirely. Separate stores were designated, all of them understocked and overpriced. Even simple goods like bread and soap became luxuries. The children learned to live with less. Miriam made soup from cabbage leaves and saved every crust of bread. Eric bartered repairs for eggs or potatoes when he could. They had stopped waiting for things to return to normal. One evening in November, the sound of boots echoed in the stairwell. Eric froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. David looked toward the door. A knock came, not hard, not rushed, but firm. When Miriam opened it, a man in uniform stood holding a folded paper. He explained that the family was now subject to relocation. A new address was listed at the bottom. They had 7 days to report there. No reason was given. No options were offered. He left without waiting for questions. That night, the family sat in silence. They had always known this moment would come. Still, the weight of it hung in the air like smoke. The place listed on the paper was a block of housing in a more isolated part of the city. Rumors had already circulated. People said it was a holding point, a step before something worse. Trains were mentioned, though no one knew where they led. Eric folded the letter and placed it beside the radio receipt. Then he began packing. This time, they didn't fold their belongings with care. There was no choosing what to bring. Just necessities: clothing, bread, soap, a photo of Eric's father, a book Lee refused to leave behind. Miriam tucked her father's psalm into her coat. David placed his small drawing of the wingless bird between the pages of a worn prayer book. The sun rose without ceremony the morning they left. They did not say goodbye to neighbors. No one opened their windows. The streets were still. Eric carried both suitcases. Miriam held David's hand while Lee walked just behind, her shoulders squared, eyes ahead. They arrived at the relocation point and waited in line. No one spoke. When their name was called, they stepped forward and handed over their papers. A clerk scribbled something in a ledger. Their documents were stamped again, this time with a code no one explained. Then they were shown to a small room in a building with dozens like it. The windows were barred. The walls smelled of damp stone and coal. There were no shelves, no hooks, no signs of those who had come before them. That night, Miriam lit one candle. She didn't say the blessing aloud. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Eric sat by the window, staring at the empty courtyard. Lee opened her book and traced her finger across the first page, though she didn't read. David placed his pillow on the floor beside her and closed his eyes. The wind outside howled softly, and for a moment, they simply waited, together, on the edge of something too large to name.